Hello everyone and welcome to my B&B CBS Gossip 24 channel. You destroyed my life is not just a line of dialogue but the emotional thesis that detonates at the center of this explosive script. A single moment stretched into a devastating chain reaction where years of betrayal, silence, longing, guilt and unresolved love finally collide in one violent, unforgettable confrontation as Taylor, pushed far beyond the limits of restraint, slaps Brooke in front of a stunned Eric, changing the trajectory of every relationship in the room and exposing the raw nerves that have been festering beneath the polished surfaces of their lives. The scene builds like a slow-burning fuse, beginning with the oppressive weight of history hanging in the air, each character entering the confrontation already carrying their own private storms, their expressions betraying the fact that this is not just another argument but a reckoning that has been delayed for far too long. Taylor arrives first, her composure brittle, her voice controlled but trembling with the effort it takes to keep decades of pain from spilling out all at once. And the audience can feel that she has rehearsed this confrontation 1,000 times in her head, imagining herself calm, dignified, above the chaos that Brooke so often represents in her life. Yet even as she speaks, it becomes clear that control is an illusion, because the wounds Brooke inflicted were never allowed to heal, only buried deeper with every smile, every apology that felt hollow, every promise that dissolved the moment desire reasserted itself. Brooke, by contrast, enters with her familiar mix of confidence and defensiveness, a woman who has survived countless scandals and heartbreaks by convincing herself that everything she does is driven by love, that consequences are unfortunate but unavoidable, and that if people are hurt along the way, it is simply because emotions are complicated and hearts want what they want. Yet beneath that self-justifying armor is a flicker of fear, because she recognizes the look in Taylor's eyes, the look of someone who has reached the end of her capacity to forgive. Eric's presence adds a third, volatile element to the scene, as he stands between them not physically but symbolically, the patriarch who has seen these cycles repeat again and again, who has benefited from their sacrifices and suffered from their conflicts, and who now watches helplessly as the women he loves unravel in front of him, realizing too late that his silence and passivity may have helped create the very explosion now unfolding. The argument begins quietly, almost deceptively so, with Taylor confronting Brooke not with screaming accusations but with measured statements that cut deeper precisely because of their restraint, listing the moments that defined her destruction. The stolen glances, the late-night phone calls, the emotional intimacy that crossed boundaries long before physical lines were blurred. The repeated pattern of Brooke inserting herself into Taylor's life under the guise of concern while slowly dismantling it piece by piece, and with each example, the audience feels the weight of cumulative betrayal, understanding that this is not about one affair or one mistake but about a lifetime of being second choice, of watching Brooke take what she wanted and apologize later, secure in the knowledge that the damage could never fully be undone. Brooke responds defensively at first, insisting that she never set out to hurt Taylor, that love is messy, that people make mistakes, and that she too has suffered, but her words ring hollow in the face of Taylor's pain, sounding less like accountability and more like well-worn excuses. And as the tension escalates, Brooke's tone sharpens, frustration bleeding through as she refuses to accept sole responsibility, pointing out Taylor's own choices, her absences, her struggles, subtly shifting blame in a way that only deepens the wound. Eric attempts to intervene, his voice raised in a plea for calm, urging them to stop before things go too far. But his words are swallowed by the momentum of the confrontation, because this moment was never going to be resolved through reason or mediation. It was always destined to erupt. Taylor's rage, long suppressed in the name of civility and emotional maturity, finally boils over when Brooke crosses the line from defensiveness into dismissal, implying that Taylor should have known better, that this outcome was inevitable, that perhaps she is clinging to a victim narrative instead of accepting reality. And in that instant, something inside Taylor snaps, the carefully constructed walls of restraint collapsing under the weight of accumulated grief and fury. Her voice rises, cracking as she shouts the words that have haunted her for years, accusing Brooke not just of betrayal but of systematically dismantling her sense of self, her trust in love, her belief that loyalty and respect could coexist with passion, declaring that Brooke didn't just take a partner or a moment but took her life as she knew it, leaving behind scars that no apology could erase. The slap itself comes in a flash, a sudden, shocking physical manifestation of emotional violence that has been simmering for decades, and the sound echoes through the room like a gunshot, silencing everything in its wake, as Brooke recoils in stunned disbelief, her hand flying to her cheek, eyes wide not just with pain but with the dawning realization that this is different from every confrontation that came before, that something irreversible has just occurred. Eric's reaction is immediate and visceral, his face draining of color as he stares at Taylor, then Brooke, then back again, struggling to process what he has just witnessed, because in all the years of drama and betrayal, violence was the one line never crossed, and its presence now signals a fundamental rupture in the fabric of their relationships. The aftermath of the slap is as powerful as the act itself, as the room fills with heavy, stunned silence, broken only by Brooke's shaky breath and Taylor's own realization of what she has done, her hand trembling as it falls back to her side, the adrenaline of rage giving way to a flood of conflicting emotions. Shame, relief, sorrow, and a strange sense of vindication. Brooke's response is layered and complex, moving from shock to anger to a wounded defensiveness that masks deeper hurt, as she accuses Taylor of crossing a line, of becoming the very thing she claims to despise. Yet even as she speaks, there is an undercurrent of guilt, an unspoken acknowledgement that the slap, while wrong, came from a place of truth she has long avoided confronting. Eric, caught in the crossfire, becomes the embodiment of the consequences of prolonged dysfunction, realizing that his attempts to keep the peace by avoiding hard truths have allowed resentment to fester unchecked, and his stunned silence speaks volumes, as he grapples with the knowledge that this moment cannot be undone, that the dynamics he once understood have been irrevocably altered. The confrontation forces each character to face themselves in uncomfortable ways. Taylor must reckon with the reality that her rage, while justified in origin, has now manifested in a way that contradicts her self-image as the moral counterpoint to Brooke, leaving her to question whether years of restraint have simply delayed an inevitable explosion rather than preventing it. Brooke must confront the undeniable impact of her choices, stripped of the comforting narrative that love excuses all, as she sees in Taylor's fury a mirror of the damage she has inflicted time and again. And Eric must accept his role not just as a witness but as a participant whose inaction and divided loyalties help set the stage for this violent reckoning. The scene resonates beyond the immediate shock of the slap because it encapsulates the central themes of the script. The corrosive effects of unresolved conflict, the illusion of forgiveness without accountability, the way power dynamics and repeated patterns can erode even the strongest sense of self, and the dangerous myth that emotional wounds, if ignored long enough, will simply fade away. As the confrontation draws to a close, there is no neat resolution, no cathartic reconciliation, only the raw aftermath of truth unleashed, with Taylor walking away not as a triumphant victor but as a woman finally acknowledging the depth of her pain, Brooke left to grapple with the consequences of a lifetime of choices that can no longer be rationalized, and Eric standing amid the wreckage, stunned into silence by the realization that one slap has changed everything, shattering the fragile equilibrium that once held them together and forcing all three to confront a future where denial is no longer an option and the cost of their shared history can no longer be ignored. In the immediate wake of the slap, time seems to stretch unnaturally as if the room itself is holding its breath, forcing each of them to sit inside the consequences of what has just happened rather than rushing toward explanation or apology. And it is within this charged stillness that the true aftermath begins to unfold, revealing that the violence of the moment was not an endpoint but a doorway into a far more painful reckoning. Taylor is the first to move, not toward Brooke or Eric but away from them, taking a few unsteady steps as if she needs physical distance just to remain upright, her back stiff, her chin raised in a fragile attempt to preserve dignity even as her eyes burn with unshed tears. Because now that the rage has discharged itself, what remains is the grief she has spent years refusing to fully feel. She speaks again, but her voice is different now, stripped of the sharp edge that fueled the confrontation, quieter, heavier, and laced with exhaustion, telling them both that she is tired. Tired of being strong, tired of being reasonable, tired of swallowing her pain to keep everyone else comfortable. And this admission lands with a weight that no scream ever could. Brooke listens, still frozen in place, her cheek flushed where Taylor struck her, not only from the physical impact but from the humiliation of being exposed so completely. Because for the first time she cannot deflect, charm, or rationalize her way out of what she has done, and the realization that Taylor's anger is rooted not in jealousy or insecurity but in genuine, accumulated harm forces her to confront a version of herself she has long avoided. Eric finally finds his voice, but when he speaks, It is halting, uncertain, as though he no longer trusts his instincts, acknowledging that he should have intervened long ago, that he allowed patterns to repeat because it was easier than facing the damage head-on, and his admission, though overdue, cracks something open in all three of them, because it reframes the conflict not as a battle between two women but as a systemic failure of honesty and accountability that he, as much as anyone, helped perpetuate. The conversation that follows is not neat or linear. It spirals, looping back through old wounds and unresolved moments, as Taylor recounts instances she never fully voiced before, times she felt invisible, dismissed, or quietly replaced, moments that seemed small in isolation but devastating in accumulation, and as she speaks, the audience understands that the slap was never about Brooke alone but about a lifetime of being forced to compete with someone who never had to fight for the same ground. Brooke's responses shift gradually from defensiveness to something more fragile, as she begins to recognize how often she framed herself as the victim of circumstance rather than the author of her own choices, admitting, haltingly, that she confused desire with destiny and used love as a justification for behavior she never had to fully reckon with. And while this admission does not absolve her, it marks a significant departure from her usual self-protective narratives. Eric listens to both women with a growing sense of shame, realizing that his attempts to be everything to everyone resulted in him being truly present for no one. And the weight of this realization leaves him subdued, his authority diminished not by the slap itself but by the truth it forced into the open. As the emotional temperature shifts from explosive to raw, the scene becomes less about blame and more about damage control, not in the sense of salvaging relationships as they once were, but in acknowledging what has been broken beyond repair and what, if anything, can be rebuilt. Taylor makes it clear that forgiveness, if it ever comes, will not be immediate or unconditional, that she can no longer be expected to absorb pain quietly in the name of peace. And this declaration is transformative, signaling a departure from her past self and the beginning of a boundary she has never fully enforced before. Brooke, for her part, struggles visibly with this new reality, because it means accepting that remorse does not entitle her to redemption, that apologies do not guarantee restoration, and that some losses are permanent, a concept she has rarely been forced to accept. Eric attempts to propose solutions. Time, space, counseling, anything that suggests continuity, but his suggestions feel hollow in the face of the fundamental shift that has occurred, and even he seems to recognize that this is not a problem to be managed but a truth to be endured. The emotional climax of the continuation does not come from another dramatic action but from a moment of devastating clarity, when Taylor articulates that the most painful part of the entire ordeal was not losing love but losing herself, and that reclaiming her identity now requires stepping away from the dynamic that defined her for so long, even if that means walking into an uncertain future alone. This statement reverberates through the room, leaving Brooke visibly shaken and Eric quietly undone, because it underscores the fact that the damage extends far beyond romantic entanglements into the core of who Taylor believed herself to be. As the confrontation winds down, the characters are left standing amid emotional wreckage, each facing a different form of loss. Taylor loses the illusion that endurance equals strength but gains a painful self-awareness. Brooke loses the comfort of denial and the assumption that love excuses harm. Eric loses the belief that neutrality is harmless, understanding too late that inaction can be just as destructive as betrayal. The scene closes not with resolution but with separation as Taylor exits the room without looking back, her departure heavy with finality. Brooke remains rooted in place, grappling with the full weight of accountability for the first time, and Eric stands between them, no longer a mediator but a witness to the consequences of a shared history that can no longer be rewritten. In this continuation, the slap becomes less a moment of violence than a catalyst for transformation, forcing each character to confront truths they have long avoided and setting the stage for a future defined not by repetition but by the difficult, uncertain work of change, proving that sometimes it takes one shocking act to expose the fractures that were always there and to make clear that survival, dignity, and self-respect often demand a reckoning far more painful than silence ever was. The fallout from Taylor's departure does not immediately manifest in loud consequences or dramatic reversals, but instead settles into the space like dust after a collapse, coating every surface of Brooke and Eric's lives with a residue that cannot be wiped away, only lived with. And it is within this quieter, more insidious aftermath that the true cost of the confrontation begins to reveal itself. Brooke is the first to break the silence after Taylor leaves, though her words are not directed at Eric so much as spoken into the void Taylor has left behind. A fractured attempt to justify herself that falters almost as soon as it begins, because without Taylor there to push against, the excuses sound thin even to her own ears. She paces the room, rubbing her cheek as if the physical reminder might anchor her to something real, something tangible enough to distract from the emotional reckoning clawing its way to the surface. But the more she moves, the more restless she becomes, her agitation driven not by anger at Taylor but by the uncomfortable realization that for the first time, she cannot rewrite the narrative in her favor. Eric watches her with an unfamiliar distance, no longer compelled to soothe or stabilize, because something in him has shifted as well, a subtle but irreversible recalibration of how he sees both Brooke and himself. And when he finally speaks, it is not to comfort but to confront, telling her that what just happened cannot be smoothed over, that this is not another crisis they can survive by waiting it out. Brooke bristles at this, instinctively defensive, accusing Eric of abandoning her when she needs support. But even as she speaks, she hears the hollowness in her words, because support has always come easily to her, often at the expense of others, and this time, it is not being freely offered. Eric's response is measured but firm, explaining that his silence in the past was not neutrality but fear of losing Brooke, fear of confrontation, fear of disrupting the fragile balance that allowed him to believe everything was manageable. And this admission lands heavily between them, stripping away yet another layer of illusion. As the conversation unfolds, it becomes clear that the SLAP did not just sever Taylor's connection to them but destabilized the entire ecosystem of relationships that once revolved around unspoken compromises and unchallenged patterns. And without Taylor's quiet endurance acting as a buffer, Brooke and Eric are forced to confront the raw edges of their own dynamic. Brooke begins to articulate something she has never fully admitted before. That part of her thrived on being desired, on knowing she could command attention even at great cost, and while she framed this as passion or inevitability, it was also a way of asserting control in a world where she often felt powerless. And this confession, halting and uncomfortable, marks the beginning of a reckoning she cannot escape. Eric listens, conflicted, because while he recognizes the truth in her words, he also sees how often he enabled that behavior by rewarding it with forgiveness and continued access. And the realization that love without boundaries can become a form of complicity leaves him visibly shaken. Meanwhile, Taylor's absence is not an empty space but a presence of its own, echoing in moments both large and small, as Brooke finds herself replaying the confrontation in her mind, dissecting every word, every expression, searching for some detail that might lessen the blow, only to find that the truth remains stubbornly intact. For the first time, Brooke is forced to sit with the full emotional weight of what she has done without the immediate relief of reconciliation or distraction, and this enforced stillness becomes its own form of punishment, compelling her to confront memories she once dismissed as inconsequential. Taylor's quiet resilience, her attempts to be gracious, the subtle ways she shrank herself to accommodate others, and as these recollections surface, they begin to reframe Brooke's self-image in unsettling ways. Eric, too, is haunted by Taylor's final words, particularly her admission that the greatest loss was herself, and he begins to see his own history through a harsher lens, recognizing moments when he prioritized comfort over honesty, harmony over justice, and how those choices, repeated over time, contributed to the erosion of trust and safety within their relationships. This introspection leads him to question not only his role in the recent confrontation but the broader patterns of his life, the ways in which he avoided decisive action to preserve the illusion of stability. And this newfound self-awareness is both painful and liberating, because it strips away the excuses he once relied on. Days pass, and the shock of the slap gives way to a deeper, more pervasive sense of loss, as Brooke attempts to reach out to Taylor. Drafting messages she never sends, rehearsing apologies that feel inadequate even before they leave her lips, because she is beginning to understand that remorse does not entitle her to access, and that Taylor's silence is not cruelty but self-preservation. Eric encourages restraint, advising Brooke to respect Taylor's need for space, a suggestion that would have once felt temporary but now carries an unsettling sense of permanence. And this realization forces Brooke to confront a truth she has long avoided, that some relationships do not bend back into shape once broken, no matter how deeply one wishes they would. Taylor, for her part, is not immediately at peace, her newfound resolve accompanied by waves of doubt and grief, as she grapples with the disorientation of stepping outside a role that defined her for so long, and in the quiet of her solitude, she begins to unpack the layers of pain she once minimized, acknowledging the anger she suppressed and the ways in which her identity became entangled with endurance rather than joy. This process is neither linear nor graceful, marked by moments of empowerment followed by crushing vulnerability, but even in her lowest moments, there is a sense that something fundamental has shifted, that she is no longer negotiating for space in her own life but claiming it outright. The narrative tension of the continuation lies not in the question of whether the characters will reconcile but in whether they will truly change, and the answer remains deliberately uncertain, because transformation, unlike drama, does not resolve neatly or quickly. Brooke's struggle becomes increasingly internal, as she confronts the discomfort of accountability without immediate absolution, learning that self-reflection is not an act of self-punishment but a necessary precursor to growth, even if that growth comes too late to salvage what has been lost. Eric's journey takes on a quieter tone, defined by a commitment to honesty he previously avoided, as he begins to speak truths he once withheld, even when they are inconvenient or destabilizing, understanding now that the cost of silence is far greater than the discomfort of confrontation. As the days stretch into weeks, the impact of the slap ripples outward, affecting not only the central trio but the broader world they inhabit as friends and family sense the shift, the unspoken fracture that no one quite knows how to address. And in these moments, the audience sees how deeply intertwined their lives were, how one act of violence, born of emotional desperation, can expose the fault lines of an entire community. The continuation resists the temptation to offer redemption.